we are a very material culture. We believe in the world you can see and touch, and have a more difficult time validating a world that is that's beyond the world we can see and touch. And I think the gift of Western culture is that we have helped define the laws of physical nature, Newton's laws, the physical laws of the universe. Because of these ways of thinking, we have contributed a lot to the world in general through the creation of science and all that. But there's more to the world than just Newtonian science. There are dimensions that we can't know just through science. We can only know through our heart. We can only know through experiencing things that are ineffable but are true, and we know they're true. We don't. So I think it's important to understand that science is important, but there are ways of knowing in our hearts, or as Jill Bolte Taylor would say, with our right brains, that are also ways of knowing that are just as important, if not more so.
Welcome to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It's Luciano here as your host. I want to thank everybody for listening in again. And I want to thank you in advance for sharing. Share with your family and friends and rate us. It always helps. Quick announcement, a very brief one, is we've just started a YouTube channel, so you're going to see some of the past guest episodes on that channel, Behind Greatness channel, obviously, but more to come on that. We have recordings all the way back to June 2022, so of this past year. But again, more on that. So today we have Dr. Jeffrey Rediger. So Dr. Rediger is an MD. He has an MDiv as well, so Master of Divinity. He's a physician. He's a best-selling author. He's a popular speaker. He's an assistant prof at Harvard Medical School and the medical director of McLean SC Adult Psychiatry and Community Affairs at McLean Hospital. He's been featured on many talk shows, including Oprah and Dr. Oz. And he has a best-selling book, Cured: Strengthen Your Immune System and Heal Your Life. And that's available at Amazon and all local bookshops. Jeff, Dr. Rediger, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Can I call you Jeff?
Absolutely.
I've been calling you Jeff, but now this is the first time I've called you Dr. Rediger, and I feel like I gotta get back to doctor.
Jeff is good.
Thank you, Jeff. So we were put in touch by Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, who also has a TEDx talk as do you, or TED Talk as do you, and she has one of the most viral TED Talks back from 2008, and she was a guest on the show in episode 100 or 101. As you know, full of energy, like unstoppable, yes. and unending. But she recommended for a specific reason that her team shared with us later, and then we had a brief talk about it. But she shared your name for a specific reason. Well, why don't we get to that reason right away? What question did you ask her that surprised her when you first met her?
Well, we met several years ago, and I asked her how she'd had this full recovery from this devastating stroke. She was working at the same hospital that I currently work at. She was at McLean Hospital as a neuroanatomy fellow at the time. So a brain scientist, had a stroke, took out much of her left brain, and she had a full recovery. And I wanted to know how she got better. And she said, I've been waiting for you for 22 years. She said, in 22 years, not a single doctor has ever asked how I had a full recovery from my stroke. And that's shocking, right? I mean, this neuroscientist, she's had a book about her stroke recovery called Stroke of Insight that's been in something like 30 languages, a perennial bestseller about stroke recovery. First TED Talk to ever go viral. She's been named by Time Magazine as one of the most important people of 2008. Oprah was doing a movie on her life until several years ago. And so this is a really famous person and more qualified to understand the deeper dynamics of stroke recovery than virtually anyone, and doctors haven't been interested. So,
why were you interested?
well, that's my area of study. And so for the last 19 years, I've been gathering medical evidence for people who do have recovery that they can demonstrate from illnesses that typically in the West we consider incurable. And it's a long story about how I became interested in this, but her pattern of recovery matches the kind of things that people do with other illnesses that I've studied, and I just wanted to know how she got better, and so that's that research has been changing my life personally and professionally for a long time.
So let's stay on that. Your TED Talk was the theme of your TED Talk was a medicine of hope and possibility.
Yeah,
And when you and I were chatting a couple of months ago now, I guess, we're chatting about a lot of things, and we'll get into some of these. I think, I hope, I expect, and I plan. So, so you said with your experience in med school, when you were asking questions of your professors, you were often told, "Don't worry about the questions; just focus on the problem sets."
yes. Yeah, that was very different than seminary at Princeton, right? I mean, in seminary, you have a chance to go deep into all kinds of big questions about, the nature of good and evil, and are people good or evil at base, and what's the nature of the universe we live in. Great opportunity to ask questions. When I arrived in med school, their position was, well, just do the problem sets. That's most important right now. And it is true that to become a physician, you need to assimilate a lot of knowledge, and just doing these problem sets does help you acquire a base of knowledge. But asking questions wasn't encouraged always, and not near the same way that seminary was. And in retrospect, I see what a powerful socialization process med school is. And I think it's still important to be able to ask questions.
Quick side note, might be related, might not, but shortly after you and I spoke the first time, my older boy's my older boy had a small episode that he just shared over dinner from that particular day in that week that you and I were speaking. So that's why I remembered it. Otherwise, I would have forgotten it forever. So he's studying life sciences, and so medicine is something that is interesting him. So he's volunteering a lot at hospitals and so forth. So he was volunteering that week at a specific department of the hospital that he hadn't been at. And he said, he was approaching a doctor who was sitting at a desk, and he said before he could open his mouth, he reached his radius. So the doctor, I guess, felt that he was going to ask him a question, and the doctor said to him, then he said, without looking up, he said, "No questions. I'm working." So, I have doctors that are friends, and I highly respect the doctors, and it's a noble profession. But maybe he was just being an asshole. But it reminded me of what you said about questions and problem sets, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and so there could be a couple things going on, right? I mean, doctors are beleaguered. They're too busy.
Sure. Yeah.
They are under more and more pressure all the time to see patients in a few minutes instead of actually sitting down and getting to the root of what's going on. So it's part of it's the nature of the way medicine has been changing over the years with these insurance companies and regulatory institutions that place so much pressure on doctors. Medicine is brilliant in some ways, but it's also a partially broken system. And there's all kinds of ways in which doctors are incentivized for things that are not always in the well-being of the patient, unfortunately.
We could easily make that another podcast discussion.
Yeah,
for sure. Mm-hmm. And it's all relevant. And I've been seeing that lately as well with recent relatives who have been deathly ill. So I've been seeing that kind of firsthand. But let's go back to the earlier theme that we were discussing. In your TED Talk, you said a few things that were really interesting for me because I listened to. I purposely wanted to get to know you before I listened to your TED Talk. So in your TED Talk, you said you learn in med school, disease starts in the body. and that you need something outside of the body to fix me. As you were discussing the differences between
Right.
Western and Eastern medicine. Why is this disjointed to you?
Well, I believed what I'd been taught for a long time, that diseases begin in the body and that our best course of treatment is to attack the body, and whether it's a pathogen or a cancerous process or whatever. But studying these individuals who have evidence for remarkable recoveries, some of them come from different cultures, and beginning to understand the ways in which they have experienced their illness and has caused me to rethink a lot of things. I've started to consider that sometimes illnesses seem to be a message that there's something that needs attention in a person's life, that the body is a messenger, or that the deeper self is sending a message through the body that perhaps there's something out of whack or out of balance in a person's life. And you start to see how the body in some ways is a metaphor for something that the person is trying to learn at a deeper level. It's upended the assumptions that I had about illness simply being about the body and not related to the deeper self.
So when you say deeper self, are you referring to the subconscious?
The subconscious, and one can language this in different ways. Certainly, spirituality or religion have talked about the presence of the soul over the centuries. The soul is a fine word, but that's even as someone who went to seminary, that's often poorly defined and lots of different opinions in the West about what that is. In the East, it's more defined and more understood, I think, or in the deeper reaches of Western Christianity that's been more ignored in recent centuries. But the deeper self is also a way to understand that. And certainly the deeper self, the soul, the subconscious, these are all walking around a set of terms that are referring in many ways to the same thing. The subconscious is what keeps our body, our heart beating, our breathing going. And the subconscious is also related to the messages that our brain and the body are sending and receiving all the time, and how much stress hormones are cascading through our body and through our beautiful immune system, and how much is the parasympathetic, the more healing mode operative. These are all related to the deeper self, to our experience of the universe and ourselves, but they have neurochemical aspects that are very important and relevant for understanding how we work and how illness heals or doesn't heal in our body.
I could see the connection here as you were speaking here, connection to the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago with Robert Doyle. We call him a wizard because he has a reputation. He's a hypnotherapist, very bright guy, very well read. And he said something as well that we took away actively from the discussion, is that the subconscious gets a vote.
Yes.
And he so he explained that also. I'm saying it in very simple terms, is that we are what our subconscious focuses on. And you said in your TED talk, I'm just making this connection now, that we become what we focus on.
Yeah.
And I see that as the same thing, because our left side of our brain is spending 24 hours a day, or our non-sleeping, or maybe our sleeping hours too, focused on what we need to do, tasks, job, family, kids, car, whatever.
Yes.
But our other half is trying to make itself heard.
That's right. And this is a really big topic. In the West, we divide mind from body and see this deep chasm between them, but they're very much more related than we have been taught to perceive through the years since the Enlightenment, when these got split apart at a very high level. It's really the nervous system that is both mind and body, and that connects both of those domains for us. And the nervous system is either in chronic fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, secreting all kinds of stress hormones in many of those ways of being. Or the subconscious is bathing the beautiful cells of our body in a neurochemistry of dopamine, the pleasure molecule, and oxytocin, the love molecule, or serotonin, an antidepressant molecule. And our body cells do really differently. They function very differently depending what kind of neurochemical environment our cells are swimming in.
Why did you go to seminary? Why did you study theology?
Because I was a confused, angry kid.
Why don't we go there? Let's go there. Why were you confused and angry?
Well, I grew up in a very conservative, violent environment. My father came out of the Amish tradition. We left the Amish community or area when I was 2. My parents left outwardly, but not so much inwardly. And it was just very difficult. The conservatism was extreme. I grew up without much access to radio or TV or even store-bought clothing at times. Couldn't go to school events or hang out with school kids. The Bible was thought to be sufficient for all knowledge. The world was suspect. Science was suspect as evolution and a tool of the devil. But the world I was exposed to in school was a very different worldview. I was reading literature and being exposed to science and math, and had great difficulty reconciling those two worlds. And so, from a young age, began to try to reconcile these worldviews, and that took me into college. And I was a rebellious kid, and then seminary became an ongoing effort to understand worldviews, to understand spiritual experience, to begin asking questions. What's the nature of the universe we live in? Is it friendly? Is it not friendly? Are we alone? What's our relationship to each other? Do people bring something good into the world? Or are we fundamentally, is there something darker about who we are? Just those questions were burning questions for me, and the seminary became a great place to try to understand those. And I had fabulous mentors who were writing theology with physicists and just going very deep into the structure of the world we live in and the universe.
You were also shunned when you left to study.
That's correct. I was, and that's something that can happen in the religious tradition that I was born into. You can be excommunicated from the family. Mm-hmm. It was very complicated because I was the oldest of 4 kids. I was
a lot is expected of you as the oldest.
A lot's expected of you, and I was doing things like going to college and then seminary and then med school, and that was all. They were torn because that seemed to be important in one way, but also is very worldly, and so shunning was how that worked itself out.
You brought up the point when we first spoke. You brought up the point about bodies keeping score. So, of course, I'm harking back to a few minutes ago when we talked about the deeper self and things evidencing in the body. In relation to your family members who remained, and how some of them became physically ill.
Well, yeah, and that's a big story right now. My father died last February, 2022. Since then, it's like the bodies are falling apart in my family, and it's tragic to watch this. 5 of us are left. My dad was blind and deaf for the last number of years of his existence. And, you can't prove or know for certain some of this, but there was some things that I think he didn't want to know. And I think the body does keep the score. The body does tell the story. And so it's really surprising. What's the likelihood that he would be blind and deaf when there's so many things about how violent our family was that that I think at some level he didn't want to know, and the role of coercive control around some of that. But my sister, who I love dearly, has been diagnosed with metastatic lung cancer since Dad's death. And she's not a smoker, but what is it that can't be expressed in our family? There's a lot that can't be expressed, unfortunately. 3 of us have had plantar fasciitis out of 5. I mean, what's the likelihood of that?
Yeah.
I had a mild case of it, but I still had it. My sister not only had plantar fasciitis, she fell and broke her foot and ankle in multiple places. My brother just had surgery for plantar fasciitis and has been struggling with a variety of gastrointestinal issues as well. And my mom has reported a lump in her breast that she's not going to work up. This has all happened since my dad's death. In the last 8 or 9 months. And what is it that can't be said in our family? I think there's a lot. And I just wish that we could talk. Yes. What we like, Gabor Mate has written this fabulous book called When Your Body Says No.
Yeah.
How many of us have these illnesses that we don't know how to say no? And so we don't know what to say yes to in our own value, and we don't know how to say no. So we set up a life where we're not just taking care of everyone else, instead of also paying attention to our own value and need for well-being. I think our hospitals and clinics are filled with people who have not been taught that they have the right to say no and set up a life that honors the particular light that we each bring.
You mentioned Gabor Mate. I want to go back to what you've just shared, but you mentioned Gabor Mate. We're in the process of seeing if you'll come on the show as well, because he's also a collaborator with one of the other guests who's been on the last month, Stephen Gyllenhaal, who's the father of Jake and Maggie Gyllenhaal.
I've heard the name. Okay.
Yeah. And they're working together in an institute where they are developing, or they are furthering the development of a therapy that was developed by a German doctor. And it's a therapy to help people uncover and then treat trauma.
Oh.
But I'll send you the notes on it if you're interested. But
I'd love to see it.
Yeah. So going back then to trauma and how it shows itself, and the vote of the subconscious that finally gets itself heard.
Yeah.
You also had a pivotal time in your life that was very traumatic. I would say like movie scene traumatic. Do you want to bring us through that?
You're talking about the death of Jane and my grandfather? Yeah. Yeah. So, right. That was very traumatic for me. I was a sophomore in college. Jane, I wasn't allowed to date when I was in high school. So I had one date prior to Jane and I beginning to get to know each other as new freshmen in college. Our relationship was 1.5 years old, and we were talking about marriage and making plans, and we had a really special relationship that meant the world to me. So my best friend in college, David, he said, you got to read this book. It's called A Severe Mercy. It's letters by Sheldon Vanauken and C.S. Lewis. It's this true story where Sheldon's wife dies. Sheldon had been a student of C.S. Lewis's, I believe, at Oxford. And in the context of mourning this deep loss for him, Sheldon is trying to come to terms with the devastation that's followed in his life since his wife's death. And C.S. Lewis at some point says, this was a severe mercy for you. This was a severe trauma for you, but it was a mercy because it gave you back your true self. David had told me I need to read this book. And so I read the book, and then Jane and I and some other college students took off for spring break, driving from Chicago to Connecticut. And Jane started reading that book that day. And we were in a car accident. Driver and Jane were killed. This was in Route 80, Northeast Pennsylvania. We came over the top of a mountain pass. The weather changed dramatically. As we came over the top of the pass, the roads were icy on that side of the mountain. The semi truck that was ahead of us jackknifed across a bridge when he hit the icy bridge, and we were the next car to come up over the top of the mountain. We tried to miss the truck, but there wasn't any way to navigate. I remember saying to the driver, try to get to the right, because there was only the only place there was any possibility was between the back of the truck and the right side of the bridge. But then we hit the icy bridge that the driver of the truck had hit, and we went into the truck. And the driver and Jane were sitting in the front seat. Jane was in the middle. I was sitting in the front seat on the right in the passenger side.
This is in 1982, so cars had bench seats in the front.
That's correct. There was a station wagon, an old Dodge station wagon with a bench seat across the front. The driver, John, was killed instantly, nearly decapitated. I took Jane out of the car. I took that bloody book out of her hands. And I had worked as an orderly in high school, and I knew that you do CPR and you don't stop until help arrives. She had bloody bubbles coming out of her neck from a gash in the neck, so her trachea had been cut, unfortunately. One of the tragedies was that they couldn't get an ambulance there because of the icy roads. They couldn't get a chopper in to land. And so it was over 2 hours before we were finally in the emergency room. I was in shock, and probably in retrospect, who knows what would have happened if I didn't just focus on doing CPR. I was just numbly doing what you have to do. So, and then I arrive at the hospital that night. Jane was dead. Found out that my grandfather in Montana, a rancher out there, had died unexpectedly of a heart attack that day. And those were two of the only people that I felt cared about me in my life at that point. And the bottom dropped out of my life. It was a devastating experience. And in the context of dealing with all that grief, it drew out a lot of other unresolved grief from my younger childhood years, from trauma, from violence. So at that point, I badly wanted to be an atheist, honestly. Religion had been such a difficult thing for me, and that extreme conservatism, and I just couldn't find a way out. But there was these strange things that happened around the scene of the accident. The first car that stopped at the scene of the accident, for example, was the family friends who were the best friends of David's family up in New Hampshire. This is on Route 80 in Pennsylvania. What are the chances of me reading this book, taking this book out of Jane's hands, and then and David, who had told me I got to read this book, then the family friend of David, he'd grown up with this family as best friends in their family, stops at the scene of the accident as the first car, and then it just continued to have these things happen. I was putting myself through college. Was sitting in school in the day when if I didn't have enough money to pay tuition on this last day, I was working 20 to 30 hours a week, also going to classes, dealing with all this grief. This is a few months after the accident, and two people sent me checks that day who knew nothing about my financial situation at all, and just simply said, "We want to let you know we care about you." And those checks were just enough to cover tuition that I could stay in college. Wow. So those kinds of things went on in connection with the accident and shortly thereafter. So as badly as I wanted to be an atheist at that point, I was such a confused, hurt, angry kid. I couldn't. There was something going on. So I ended up discarding a lot of the religious beliefs that I had been raised in, but I went to seminary in an effort to understand that experience. So I walked into the Princeton Seminary campus a few years later and asked, is there anybody interested in Kierkegaard? I was finding Kierkegaard to be very helpful for my existential despair. And I also wanted to know if there's anyone interested in psychology and theology. And there's this professor named James Loder, who is this world-class scholar in both Kierkegaard academic work and also in psychology and theology. And it was way beyond anything I'd ever thought possible for academics to study in terms of depth and the level of work he was doing. And he was writing books with physicists at the time and going deep into theology, physics, theology of science, or philosophy of science, and just was a fabulous mentor for me during those years in seminary. And he said he had written a book called The Transforming Moment that started off with his own accident experience, and said it's very complicated to become a spiritual person when you're already a tenured professor of theology in seminary. So he just talked about the transformation of his own beliefs, and he said you just got to take your experience and let it stand on its own terms, and begin to, because he said that accident is when you are closest to reality. And a lot of your other ways of thinking were overlayered with cultural beliefs or with your own denial, your own traumas. He said in that experience you had, that was a transforming potential for you. And that's when you're most in touch with reality, and let that inform your existence and define your intellectual categories. And that became a journey for me.
Well, let's set aside talk of intellectual categories.
Yeah.
For the sake of this question,
yeah.
You were closest to your reality. What does that mean for you? Set aside your intellectual exploration at that moment in time.
Yeah, I think it's in moments of crisis sometimes that we are most in touch with what is true. We can go through our lives. We can, I up to that point in my life, certainly denial of pain, ways of coping, defensive structures that I had to help me get through my day, played a role, I think, in how I coped with things. But in that existential crisis of the car accident and losing Jane, losing my grandfather that day, I was most in touch with trauma, with the people, with what it means to love, to lose love. I mean, when a similar example, when a train is bearing down on you, you're most in touch with what's most true in you. All the other extraneous things get set aside. And I think it was that kind of moment for me where lots of things that felt important maybe a week prior to that, didn't matter. What mattered was the people I loved, the people I lost, relationship. Those were what mattered. And in that moment, I was more in touch with the base truths of our existence in a way that I defended myself, I think, through much of my other days in school and work.
Do you still feel that same love from your grandfather and from Jane as you did 40 years ago?
Yeah, I do. I mean, they have they're important memories for me that I've thought a lot about over the years. What does it mean to still have their presence with me in some way? There's a lot I don't understand. There's mysteries I don't understand about physical life and death and what persists after death. I don't know how to think about that. Different religions and cultures answer those questions differently. They're all getting at something true. I think the invisible world is real. Maybe not always the way a particular religion may talk about it, but there's still something real behind appearances, something in the invisible world that is compelling. But there's a mystery there that I don't fully understand. That's for sure.
Well, so part of the discussions that we have here in the podcast, we're trying to explore this and have discussions with people who are actively exploring it too. So yeah. I appreciate your candidness here. So why do you say the invisible world is real? What is real? Define it for us.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big thing, right? I mean, I'm trained as a scientist. And
Hmm.
so but it turns out that the Newtonian Cartesian model of science that's been operative in our culture since the Enlightenment, and that's slowly starting uh, to be adapted into a very different worldview as the the indubitable proof of quantum physics is slowly seeping into our consciousness through the digital revolution. So our assumptions and our beliefs and our perceptions and interpretations of the world and the universe and ourselves is slowly changing. Uh, Quantum physics is not a theory; it's it's a fact that has been proven over and over thousands of times, and we're still trying to grapple with such a different set of beliefs than the Newtonian Cartesian model of science, which can only study the things that we can see and touch. It's
Right.
Newtonian science, Cartesian science is really about the evidence of the five senses. So there's so many things that we can't study. You can't reduce love to um, something of the five senses. It's beyond that. We all made believe that love exists in our hearts, but we can't prove that through the kind of science that's been operative since the Enlightenment. That's a really big topic. So there's things that we can know, but we can't prove.
We've spoken to other MDs as well here, trained
Yeah.
MDs, and there's a specific psychiatrist out of University of Virginia who has spent the last 45 years um, amassing scientific evidence of the near-death experience.
Yeah, that's right.
Bruce Grayson,
That's right. Mm-hmm.
a lovely man, and we had him on the podcast. And we've also had an MD as well who went through a near-death experience. And so the reason why I
Wow.
mentioned them, his name is Tony Chicoria,
Hmm.
episode 55, I think, 55, 56, because you mentioned love. And in his story, in his experience, in the recounting of his experience,
Yeah.
he said that when he left his body, he still felt like him, but he was something else, and he was turning into something else, and he was completely surrounded by love. This
Wow.
is an unconditional love I did not want to leave. And he was
Yeah.
upset when he was revived. He had
Yeah.
an emergency room nurse who happened to be behind him when this happened. He was hit by lightning, and she revived
Oh,
him. He
wow.
was upset.
Oh, right.
But the invisible world for him was love. And then, of course, we talked about sound and music, and it was incredible.
Uh,
Um, but that's why I asked you about love, because that was the only thing in that moment in time, the only thing that mattered to you, and the two people that mattered to you that gave you the love and the care
yes.
were
Right.
gone in that instant.
Yes.
I could imagine how it was a shock to the system, but I mean that would bring you to a life of exploration 100% if you wanted to think about these things. And
Yes.
I mean that's where you are.
Yeah. Yeah, it did. So it set me off on this journey. And I think there's a lot of ways to talk about that. But one of the things that happened is that the structures of religion that I'd been schooled in did begin to drop away. And I was left with these deeper possibilities of connection with those I do care about, and beginning to realize the importance of our feelings, subjective as we might consider them in the West. They
Mm.
are really important for feeling and for healing our traumas. There's something in all of us, I think, that is scanning the room constantly when we walk into a room, looking for an experience of unconditional love. There's something in us that does not rest until we find that. Ultimately, I think that has to come from within. But the people I study with these amazing recoveries, uh, their their healings were so fundamentally connected with that deeper experience of love or unconditional positive regard, if you could call it that. So, and the reduction or elimination of barriers that prevent us from experiencing love at that level. So
You
yes, you're raising big questions.
and you did in the discussion of your four pillars in
Yes.
your book, and in some of the discussions I've heard you give or interviews I've heard you give, and the fourth pillar is I mean, now listening to your story again,
Mm,
and it wasn't, let me tell you, I still had goosebumps when you're giving that story
yeah,
the second time. Um, the fourth pillar about is healing your beliefs and your identity. And it's
yeah,
obviously something you went through yourself.
yeah,
Um, let me add something there, because I think part of, I think my own personal experience and speaking to people who've had experiences that they've shared on the podcast, I think part of the healing also comes with understanding that in being open for beliefs, that your own beliefs can crack, crumble, or shatter, and that
yes,
being open to the initial hurt you might feel,
yeah.
um, and the new opening and new beginnings that might occur once you get over that.
Yeah, and that's beautifully said. I think the people I've studied with these amazing recoveries, um, over and over, they've told me that it was the healing of their beliefs and their identity that was the most important part of this. And that's why, in retrospect, they are so grateful for this illness.
Mm.
We talk about nutrition, healing one's relationship with nutrition, healing one's immune system, healing one's relationship with stress, and that's all well and good. But when people get to this deeper level where they are talking about the healing of identity, the healing of false beliefs, that's when they sit up, they get this light in their eye, and they want me to understand this part. This is where the money is in terms of the healing. My publisher said that he really believes in cured, because he said 40 books will be written on nutrition this year, but he said nobody's ever said that if you want to heal at the deepest level, you need to heal your beliefs and your identity. And I think that's true. I think it's really the most difficult pillar in cured that I'm discussing. It's the most abstract. It's the most difficult one to get one's mind around. But that is the biggest thing in terms of healing. And all of us grow up. We have parents and we adopt beliefs from our parents, from kids on the playground,
Hmm.
from kids in junior high.
Yeah,
and
well, for
some of these
sure.
some of these beliefs are true, some of them are false, some of them are conscious, some of them are unconscious. But I think the truth is, if some of these beliefs that we have are true and some of them are false, if we have a mixed set of beliefs in our body and our mind and our life, we will have mixed results in our body and mind and life. And so I think the um, what I'm have been learning is that when we have beliefs that soothe our body, that allow us to experience the unrepeatable value and dignity of what we bring in the world, and we can remove beliefs that contradict that or get in the way of experiencing that, or get in the way of experiencing our connection with others, there is something that changes in our physiology. A physiology that doesn't acknowledge our value is going to be more connected with the stress physiology of bathing our beautiful cells in stress hormones like cortisol or norepinephrine or adrenaline. That's a very different physiology uh, than the parasympathetic way of living and experiencing ourselves in the world. And we know on the basis of clinical and laboratory evidence that when our bodies are constantly bathed in the stress hormones, they begin to misfire. They begin to become sluggish. They miss the pathogen and attack the body that it's sworn to protect. I mean, that's what autoimmune disease is. And most of the illnesses from which people suffer, including all the major killers, are autoimmune. Cancer is autoimmune. Diabetes is autoimmune. Uh, Heart disease is autoimmune, and autoimmune diseases are skyrocketing around the world, especially in the Western countries right now. And so to begin to understand all this from a very different perspective and ask good questions instead of just studying the problem sets and is really important.
You spend a month asking the right questions in a certain place that made you feel seem more relaxed and thoughtful. So I asked you before we recorded if you missed that 1 month at Esalen, and smile came across her face, as it is now, as it is.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah.
Tell us about Esalen. Tell us about your experience, what it is, number one, but your experience there.
Yeah, Esalen is this fabulous place in Big Sur, California, and it's been really the birthplace for the human potential movement in many ways. Its beginning came during the early 60s, and it played a big role in the foment of those years culturally. It has been associated with what we call New Age, but they aren't New Age. They're very interested in how to bring together a cross-fertilization of the best of East and West ways of thinking, Eastern philosophy with Western science. And there's been many great teachers and leaders that have come through there. They played a role in backdoor diplomacy when they brought Gorbachev to the United States and would just take Gorbachev around to different places in our culture. And it was I think it was in a grocery store in Houston where Gorbachev had this experience like, oh, wow, he'd been taught so much propaganda about what the United States is. And here's this well-organized, well-stocked, very efficiently run grocery store, which contradicted so much of what he'd been taught. And he went back and renounced a lot of the propagandic beliefs that had been part of his training and that played a significant role in what happened then and the coming down of the wall in Germany. And there was just a lot that unfolded from that, both in Russia and in associated ways of thinking in other countries. And so Esalen played a role in these kinds of things and continues to be a place that says you can't just heal from trauma without knowing yourself, without knowing others. And this is not just a cognitive process. There's this idea that our bodies do tell the story, our bodies do keep the score, and there's somatic wisdom that our bodies are trying to send us messages, and can we get in touch with those messages and listen to our bodies so that we can heal? Esalen does a very beautiful plays a beautiful role in helping us begin thinking about those, and it's just been a really good antidote for me as somebody who's in the East. Northeast, where we are too exclusively cognitive in our approaches to trauma healing and medicine. So,
well, in that sense, I'm going to repeat something you told me of Esalen. So when you said you're too rigid, cognitively rigid, I mean, I'm sure you've heard it many times. It's sometimes science becomes too much of a religion, where it weighs too heavily. And impedes curiosity. And you said Esalen is a place of the religion of no religion.
Yes.
And that it's a place where the veil is thinner.
Yes, I think it is. And many others have spoken about what that means.
How do you believe you exist after your cells die, your body dies?
Well, we're talking about something that I don't pretend to have all the answers for. There is a mystery here. I do believe that the invisible world is real. When I have been in other countries, sometimes I'm struck by how Brazil or Thailand, for example, will use some of the same words that we use, but they'll mean something entirely different. And for example, some of these cultures, the invisible world is more real than the visible world. And so they will talk about regular contact with those who've loved ones who've died, or people who've are beloved who have died but appear in dreams. And they experience these things very differently than we do. We are a very material culture. We believe in the world you can see and touch, and have a more difficult time validating a world that is that's beyond the world we can see and touch. And I think the gift of Western culture is that we have helped define the laws of physical nature, Newton's laws, the physical laws of the universe, because of these ways of thinking, we have contributed a lot to the world in general through the creation of science and all that. But but there's more to the world than just Newtonian science. There are dimensions that we can't know just through science. We can only know through our heart. We can only know through experiencing things that are ineffable but are true, and we know they're true. We don't. So I think it's important to understand that science is important, but there are ways of knowing in our hearts, or as Jill Bolte Taylor would say, with our right brains, that are also ways of knowing that are just as important, if not more so.
So thank you for sharing that. Very eloquent. You still didn't answer the question, but
I'm a psychiatrist. You think I answer anything correctly?
You're good. You're good. But it's one I still appreciate anyway. So my question then, I guess my follow-up question is, and I'm going to give you some context before I ask it. We've had people here on the podcast who actively talk about and have spoken about research and work and their lives exploring the invisible. So one of them was Antonia Mills, and she's a social scientist and studied scientifically created evidence of reincarnation stories in tribes, within tribes in British Columbia. We have a medium. We've had a medium. Her name is Suzanne Giesman. She used to be a U.S. naval commander for a couple of decades and is now a medium. And then just recently, social scientist as well. Her name is Marguerite Rigoglioso. Who is a founder of a mystery school. And she talked at length with us about the reality of the invisible world and how the myths, the stories that we think are myths are actually histories.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, I say wow as well. I keep an open mind. You're a medical professional, and you're a scientist. What are your comments about? What are your thoughts about actively exploring this side, or excuse me, that side of the human experience?
Well, I have come to believe in the immortality of the soul. I think that we are fundamentally these invisible souls walking around, and our bodies are a metaphor for something that the deeper self or soul in us is trying to learn at some level. And so I believe it behooves us to ask what it is that our bodies are trying to tell us. What are the messages our bodies are sending? That's something that as physicians, we should be asking and helping patients do. I'm reminded, I just received several emails recently by a famous writer who's at least one of his books has become a very famous movie. And he had a father who was a physicist, was a very much an atheist. This new friend has lived his life as an atheist as well. He was in a accident, a medical accident, not a car accident. And he had a pancreatic artery burst, and he nearly died. He had a near-death experience in the context of that, and now is trying to figure out what to do, because an atheist who had an experience like this. So now he has been writing me these emails asking for recommendations of theology that he can read, books about physics, and he's just not sure what to do because he can't discount that experience, but it goes against everything he thought he believed. So,
so I don't know him and I don't know the story other than what you've just related, but he's following a curiosity.
Yes, that's right.
He's not ignoring it.
Right. He's wondering how much is this going to mess up his life, because he's set up this whole life with a set of beliefs that now are being questioned.
Well, last point on this. So thank you for sharing that too. Dean Radin, who's a chief scientist at IONS in California, he explained how he working at Stargate program, which is run by the CIA at Stanford Institute, that Russell Targ, who's also been on the podcast too.
Yeah.
And he said with the remote viewing program, we were a bunch of scientists applying this to military advantage, but we weren't allowed to talk about it. And the scientific community was poo-pooing it, and we couldn't say anything about it. He goes, I finally had to leave because there was so much science that was being explored that we had to suppress. But he said, the reason why I bring this up is because they would bring in skeptics, or skeptics would want to know what they're doing. And they would come in, and he said, it just always happened this way. We would blow their mind on what remote viewing, on how everybody is and how they were capable of remote viewing. And we'd have to keep them on site for a few days because their beliefs were shattered. And so they couldn't go back that way because they couldn't go back home because they left a pure skeptic and they come back and they would, like, their whole life would have to be rebuilt. So we'd have to have them spend some time and talk to them, I guess, therapy and whatever. I'm imputing my own ideas.
Right.
But that's the idea, going back to your fourth pillar about healing. I think we have to be open to the fact that maybe we're not as curious as we thought we were.
Yeah.
Like, to cite your atheist friend.
Yeah. I mean, when I was a very young child, probably 5 or 6 years old, a Sunday school teacher said to me something like, what percentage of world knowledge do you think you have? And I think that's still relevant. If someone asked me what percentage of the world's knowledge do I think that I possess after someone who went through seminary for 3 years, going deep into science and philosophy of science and theology, and then going to med school and residency in psychiatry, I would still have to say that of all the world's knowledge, I know such a small infinitesimal fraction of 1%. That's got so many zeros behind that decimal. and so, how learning one piece of new knowledge can completely reform sometimes one's beliefs. I feel like a little ant that's looking up, and maybe a person's looking right down at me and I can't even see them because they just fill the sky, for example. And so I'm somebody who went to school for many, many, many years in multiple different disciplines, and I still know so little. And I think that's true for all of us as human beings. So there's so much we don't know or understand.
There is one thing that you said that really touched me. You said when you walk in. So again, I'm paraphrasing you, and tell me if I'm off. Maybe I misunderstood it. But you said it's when you walk into a room, there is something there invisible. You're looking for an unconditional love when you walk into a room. And I think if you move past the fact that you want to be accepted, like anybody want to be accepted when they walk into a room, if you bring that further, why is it that you feel you need to be accepted or you want to be accepted? What is it that's invisible that's happening there underneath because something wants to connect?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, this is, again, beyond what science can easily capture as it's currently constructed. There is something in us that doesn't rest until it finds an experience of our value, I think. And every person brings something of such magnificent, unrepeatable value into the world that just simply is what it is. And that we are also so fundamentally connected to each other. We walk into a room and we can sense sometimes when somebody's looking at us, and we turn, and yes, they are looking at us. I mean, there's some kind of energy that goes on at the invisible level that we don't have sophisticated instruments to capture this yet. I suspect someday we will.
Maybe we're the sophisticated instrument that we've just been ignoring it the whole time.
Well, that's actually beautifully said, and that is what the spiritual masters say. So yeah, that's beautiful. There is something there. We are the instruments, and how to open ourselves up to that being what is the case is the question.
Last question to you. What does greatness mean to you?
That's a very good question. I'm evaluating that a lot these days. I've pursued the structures of prestige. I'm considered very privileged now with the education I've had and the affiliations I've had. And I'm realizing how empty they are, how much we are all just human beings, and we wear these different masks and we reify these masks. We create hierarchies of fear based on comparing ourselves to each other. We decide what we think is important. And yet the truth is we all are human beings of equal value. We all bring a similar light into the world, and it's not like some people have more of that light of the divine in us than others. And I'm realizing, just as I did in the car accident many years ago, when you're reduced to what's most important and all the different levels of denial dissipate, what matters is how much we are able to give and receive love with each other, how much we are able to experience our profound connection with each other. I have had a lot of defenses against experiencing that. I've pursued things in life that don't matter as much, and realizing the futility of that, the loss associated with that, and realizing that following what the principalities and powers of our world, if you could use that term, call great, isn't great, actually. And my partner and I, Lissa Rankin, she's a physician who's written a lot of books that talk a lot about these issues, are realizing that becoming well-known, becoming famous, becoming wealthy, these are empty. And what matters at the end of the day is what allows us to experience our connection with each other, to experience the value that we each bring in the world, and to see the real person instead of the masks that we wear. That's what I'm realizing. That's where greatness lies. And that's a really different path that I just in the early state of the beginning to deal with.
That is quite beautiful. Love and connection is what I got from this.
And healing our traumas so that we can remove the barriers and experience that more fully. That's a really different path. And it means dying to old ways of being that I've been far too wedded to.
Let's leave it on that point. That's wonderful. Old ways of being and shedding them. Jeffrey, thanks again. Thank you for sharing thank you for sharing your personal experiences, number one. But your honesty as an MD and as a human being. Very refreshing.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. These are really important questions. Just want each of us to better experience the value that we each bring.
Thank you.
Hey, it's Enrico Colantoni here, actor, director, and dedicated napper. Like what you heard today, there's more to come. Make sure to subscribe to Behind Greatness and learn about our live events at inspirenorth.com. You'll also find links to our social media right on our website, so be sure to give us a like and follow. Until next time, stay inspired.